mighty fortresses are
Welcome to Double Portion, a Lutheran podcast done by two pastors talking about the intersection of studying scripture and Christian living. My name is Chris Flugaft. I'm the pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Yorba Linda, California. Here with my brother, Tony Flugaft, pastor at Christ the Vine Lutheran.
Twin brother, hence the double portion, too.
Yes. So today I wanted to ask you, Tony, what are some of your core memories, and why do you think those stick out in your mind?
As I think of my core memories, I think a lot of my memories from childhood come from vacations. I read somewhere that a large percentage of our memories come from vacations or times that we're not doing the usual. Perhaps it's because your brain kind of goes in more of an autopilot when you're doing the usual. There's an interesting book that I read about this idea at one point where it's the power of habit, and your brain just kind of assumes a lot of things when you're doing the regular. So vacations actually stand out as something different. So I think of times like when we went to Asheville, North Carolina. I remember a really bad sunburn that I got. I remember going up to Eagle River, Wisconsin to visit Grandma and Grandpa and go tubing and have fires when we were up there visiting them. I think of when we would go to El Paso, Texas, visiting one of our dad's friends. That's where we were born, and we would go see the Sun Bowl, this minor college football bowl game, and see two teams playing. That was always fun. So when I think of some of my core memories, I think of times that we went on vacation as a family.
Yeah. It's interesting as you are mentioning those, because those all include sports. I remember getting Charlotte Bobcats shirts when we went to Asheville. I remember going to those bowl games. I also remember getting a Texas Western basketball jersey from the bookstore at the University of Texas, El Paso. As I'd answer that question, I might say sports created a lot of my core memories. I remember playing grade school football, and I particularly remember one game where we were playing at night under the lights, and I remember the songs that played before the game. I remember the Enduro from high school football and how that was supposedly this big marker of how much work we did during the off season.
And even though we were linemen, we would still win that. But,
well, that was
not to brag. But.
That was always my goal, was to at least win it for the offensive lineman, to be the first offensive lineman that was finish it. And then I would also think of, in my ministry, coaching flag football and the time spent with the kids in that setting. So sports has a lot to do with my core memories. And I think sports can become a really important part of life for so many people. And that's why I think it'd be worthwhile for us to talk about Christian living and sports. So you had some notes jotted down that you wanted to take as we would address this topic.
Yeah. So I thought it might be a nice way to kind of address this topic by considering some thoughts and reacting to them. And so the first thought I wanted to address was this idea that sports are this indispensable character builder, that in order to learn many important life skills, or even Christian life skills, someone needs to participate in sports, particularly team sports. It's going to teach you discipline, maybe stewardship of time. It's going to teach you teamwork, and maybe some other life lessons. And so sports often get talked about as just this very important character builder for the individual. What do you think of that? Is that true? Is maybe that overplayed? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think there's a huge benefit to sports and participating in these things. As you go through the book of Proverbs, you see how a haughty spirit is often spoken against. And for most people in sports, this is something that levels the playing field. It is a reason for them to not have a haughty spirit, because they recognize, I'm not as good at this thing as other people are. And so you think of a basketball team, say your team has 10 players on it, there is going to be 9 of those people who aren't the best person.
Mhm.
And on some level, they're going to have to wrestle with that and deal with the truth that there's someone else that's better at this than I am. And I think that's really important for us as we approach our lives to have that humility. So sports can do a really good job of teaching that, whether that's taking the losses, whether that's not being the starter on the team, or however it might look, to teach you to not have a haughty spirit. But then done in the right perspective, it can also be directed to say, where do you find your true identity? If it's not in hitting threes or scoring touchdowns, where do you find your true identity? And could be a wonderful opportunity for instructing these things.
I think back into different times in my life where maybe I didn't make the basketball team or I didn't play as much as I would have wanted to, where that actually was very healthy in hindsight to see, hey, you're not the best at this, and that's okay. And so maybe even then also learning I can function in a role where I'm not the best. That's just the reality of life. You're going to be in different settings where you're not the best at this individual thing, and that's okay. You can still serve and work and do your best, even if you're not the one who has the light shined on them as to the most successful individual.
Yeah. I am someone who I'm just built to want to make gains, to grow, but also to gain responsibility. So that's a good lesson to learn through sports, that it's okay if I'm not number one. So I was teaching a Bible study this morning on the Gospel of Mark. And again, we see that Peter, James, and John are the inner three. They get special privileges the other disciples don't get. And I was kind of contemplating, I wonder how challenging that was on Andrew. Or what about Matthew? How about Matthias, a follower of Jesus who wasn't even one of the original 12 disciples? But it's good for us to learn that we can have a check on our own egos and then have an opportunity to rejoice in those who do receive these gifts, who have that privilege. So then when you're on a team, and to say, hey, we have a good player and we're going to rejoice in the gifts that he's been given, even though that's not me. So I think that's a huge thing that you can learn through sports. You can have a proper perspective on gifts, a proper perspective on your role in life and society. And then again, directing that to identity, to say at the end of the day, your failures in this realm aren't what give you your true identity.
When I think of the value of sports, one of the most important skills that I think gets taught through playing sports is the skill of discipline, and how valuable it is for an individual to learn to be disciplined, to learn to say no to themselves. This is a skill that you have to learn in sports as you're making decisions. Am I going to go and hang out with my friends on this Thursday after school, or am I going to go to the weight room and work out and do what I need to do to get better? Am I going to go play video games at night, or am I going to practice ball handling for basketball or watch film for football? There's a lot of times where you need to make sacrifices, be disciplined to be better. And I think as a Christian, discipline is an incredibly valuable skill that unfortunately maybe doesn't get talked about as much as it should. We actually do think fasting's a good thing, not just for the fad diet benefits of it, but because it's a spiritual exercise, saying no, denying the flesh. It's a practice in denying oneself, denying the flesh for the times that you need to deny the flesh in service to God. And so I think sports can teach that discipline. I'm going to say no to maybe something I would enjoy more to do what's better for me. And so you learn that skill by playing sports for the future when you need to say no to the sinful flesh in order to serve God.
Yeah, I think it can be a great training ground for kids to learn that there are consequences to a lack of discipline, consequences to laziness, and very much a controlled atmosphere. So at the end of the day, if a kid doesn't start, their team doesn't win the championship, it's not that big of a deal, but it teaches them because it's real and it's important to them. So you come back after the off season not having worked out, and you started last year and this year you don't start. It teaches you a lesson. And as you noted, it's a biblical characteristic, quality that's encouraged. I referenced Psalms talk about a haughty spirit, or Proverbs rather. Proverbs also talks about laziness a lot. So I'm thinking about Proverbs 19:15, where it says, laziness brings on deep sleep, and the shiftless go hungry. It's a hard lesson to learn that as an adult. But to teach your kids the truth that laziness has consequences through a sport can be a tremendous blessing to them. It's even a blessing beyond the realm of children and what they experience. So what I'm thinking about is I recently got through an audiobook called Embrace Discomfort, written by a man named Michael Easter. Michael Easter doesn't seem to be a Christian. He writes a newsletter called the 2%er newsletter. And it's the idea of taking on the difficult, small things on a daily basis that only 2% of society does, like walk up the stairs instead of taking the elevator. And I think sports can teach that very well. Do the little things, and that adds up after a while. And that's a huge blessing, not just while you're playing sports, but it has a blessing on long-term health and the rest of your life. And since we recognize that caring for our bodies and interacting with other people is how we glorify God, then it has an important aspect in our spiritual well-being too.
As Christians, we think the little things matter. It says in both Deuteronomy and Revelation, do not add to what I've commanded you and do not subtract. We take it all as important. The little things matter. And so maybe teaching someone little things matter is a valuable lesson from playing sports. And you think of the saying, well, practice makes perfect, but then people say, well, actually, really, it's perfect practice makes perfect. It's not just doing it, but doing it right, doing it the right way, focusing on the little things that actually helps someone to be better. And the sinful, lazy heart would like to take shortcuts and cut corners, but if you want to do this right, if you want to succeed, you need to do this right. And I think that's maybe a valuable lesson to apply then to the Christian life. We can't just cut corners. We can't just ignore the little things. It's all important.
Yeah. So we played offensive line in high school, and you think if you have a guard who is pulling and he's going to hit the outside linebacker and he hits the inside linebacker instead, that might seem like a very insignificant thing, but actually that could blow up the entire play, because now you have two guys blocking potentially the inside linebacker instead of one of them getting the outside linebacker who then makes the tackle.
So he took the shortcut, the easier route to get the guy who was in front of him instead of the person he was supposed to get, and that was damaging to his team. And so maybe talking about that, applying just in the Christian life, if we want to take shortcuts, do the lazy thing, that's not going to be good for us. It's not going to be good for our neighbor. And so maybe that's another important conversation about sports that we haven't fully addressed, this idea of teaching teamwork. This idea that we like to think of the Christian at home alone with their Bible is just not the idea that the Bible presents about the Christian faith, the Christian life. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people shouldn't read their Bibles. I think people should read their Bibles at home alone. I think that's a wonderful practice. But this idea that, I just read the Bible at home alone, I live the Christian life very individually, is just not the way the Bible talks about it. We see people coming together, and we see the conversation about being a body of believers being built together. And so we live in community with fellow believers, and we're going to need to learn to work together. So teamwork is a valuable skill to learn as a believer, because you're not going to all be the mouthpiece. You're not all going to be the one who does the outwardly recognizable job. Some of you are going to be the offensive linemen of the church, and you're doing the things that maybe don't get noticed, and that's okay. It's good for the body as a whole. And sometimes you're going to need to sacrifice in order to do what is good for the entire body. So you think about how people talk about churches sometimes have fights over what color the paint's going to be, or what color the carpet's going to be. And it's saying, no, it's not always about what I want. I can sacrifice for the good of the body, maybe you could say the team. And so there's a valuable skill that people learn from playing sports together, is that sometimes you need to sacrifice what you want for the good of others.
Yeah. Yeah. And that good of others, that care for others, that love for others, it's being a teammate. It's also being a friend. And another proverb that I would want to share in connection is in 18:24. One who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin. But there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. A lot of times people will make that a Christological psalm and point out that this is the greatest friend we have is Jesus. What a friend we have in Jesus. It's true. But this is wisdom shared for believers to be a reliable friend. You want to be that reliable friend on the team. Why does everyone love Cam Scatabo on the New York Giants? Because that guy is reliable. I saw him drive back and put on his own back a defensive end. That's crazy to see a running back do that, to actually care about that. That's why people love Cam Scatabo. So to see people do stuff like that, to say, I'm going to be a reliable teammate, I'm going to be a reliable friend, that's a wonderful lesson to learn in our lives as Christians.
Yeah. Or you think of the often quoted, like, as iron sharpens iron. I mean, this is a biblical quote. Maybe it's not exactly making the case that sometimes it's used in sports, but we do sharpen one another as we grow together, as we strengthen one another. And so there's that value of learning in sports to be a reliable friend, but also to sharpen one another. And so then as Christians, applying that to our life together, we want to sharpen one another. We want to help each other be the best that we can be. Now, with the reaction to this thought, one of the things that I wanted to ask is this as indispensable as some may act like it is?
Yeah, I think we need to be careful and cautious in saying something like sports is the only place to learn these character qualities. It can be a place, but there may be some better locations to learn it at home, through mom and dad teaching it, through participation in the church community. Kids are part of the church community. They can learn these things through that as well. Or even different organizations, such as my previous congregation, we had Lutheran Pioneers and Girl Pioneers, and those organizations done well and done right can teach many wonderful character qualities to children.
Yeah, I think of whether it was in high school or college, there were students who worked part-time jobs, and that impacted the way that they were able to participate in the sport. And there was almost this unspoken, well, oh, this person's not at this extra optional weightlifting session. They must be lazy or something like that because they're working a job. And acting like the sport is the only way that you can learn these skills is just not true. That person's learning a lot of very valuable skills from working that part-time job, and in some of those cases, they're helping to pay for their education. I think of even instances of people who went to high school they were helping to pay for their high school education with their part-time job, and maybe they couldn't put in the time for the sport, but they were learning valuable skills. And so there are times where I think it gets perhaps overvalued. We give a lot of recognition in school to the athletes, but how about the people who are learning these skills in other realms?
Yeah.
And maybe that comes from this American idolatry of sports even. But there are other ways, like you said, other ways you can learn these skills. And just because someone doesn't love sports doesn't mean that they can't learn these skills. Or sometimes they get cut from the team, and then are you saying, well, we said they're not good enough to play, and now they can't learn that skill? Well, again, that's not true.
Yeah, and I think we both had firsthand experience with that, working high school jobs. Rest in peace to Uno Chicago Style Grill in Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. We both had good experiences working there in high school and in college, and learned skills there too. So I was an expediter of the food, and there were times on Friday nights that was very stressful. And perhaps more stressful than a Friday night football game, because it was the actual livelihood of some of those people that was
Yeah.
dependent on. So some of those people, they needed that table to go well so they could get that tip so they could pay for their
Yeah.
rent. And that was a stressful thing to go through, having to work with them and work through it. So a lot of those skills can be learned outside of sports as well, maybe even more effectively.
I definitely think I learned more life lessons and life skills from working part-time jobs than sports. I guess it's hard to think about that exactly, but um, like you said, the stress of a Friday night rush of how am I going to balance all of this while being considerate of the people that I'm working with, and the reality in a way that's almost different than sports that um, there I'm going to make a mistake. Like when you're like there's a busy rush, it just happens, and it's not just this game that's on the line, but like you said, these people's livelihood, and so I do think there's a lot of very valuable lessons I could learn from part-time jobs, and so sometimes they get pitted against each other though, and I just think of like conversations had in college of people not being able to play sports, but it's like, well, college costs a lot more now than it used to, and people need part-time jobs, and this is valuable, and they're still learning valuable lifetime skills. One of the things I remember Aaron's grandpa, who was a pastor, had told me at one time was he said that he wished that guys were still working real valuable ministry jobs while they're at seminary, and the joke was because I was working for a church while at seminary, and he used to work at a liquor store, and he was saying there's just this value to getting these experiences out in the real world with different people of different backgrounds, and a job that's going to be very different from something you're training to do. And so I do think we don't want to overplay the value of sports compared to other opportunities for learning life skills.
Yeah, I think like I played football, tackle football from 7th grade through sophomore year of college. And I was benefited and I got blessings through that. And I learned work ethic, I learned teamwork, I learned discipline through those things. But then I worked as an expediter and delivery driver at a restaurant. I worked in a gas station. I worked in a concrete factory. I worked as a roofer. I worked in a daycare. I had all of these other opportunities working part-time jobs and learned a lot from those as well. So to not uplift one thing for the high schooler and not the other.
Yeah. Another, maybe shifting directions now, another question that I wanted to throw out there, a thought I wanted to throw out there for you to react to, is there's this maybe growing sentiment out there in what's called the manosphere that liking sports as an adult man to the point where you're putting on someone else's jersey is not manly. And so they'll even say like, I would never put some other man's last name on my back like that. And I saw another take that was like, my life is too interesting to care about sports because I've got all this other stuff going on. And so this idea of that they belittle liking sports. What would you say to someone who would say, I would never put another man's last name on my back by wearing that jersey?
Yeah. So on one hand, I get the caricature of what they're building. They don't want you to fanboy over some other man. I think, unfortunately, maybe there's some less than constructive things they're getting into by creating that caricature.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it's okay to have heroes in your society that you respect. So I think it's called like the big men theory of history. Is becoming a little bit less desired, but it was the way you approached history by looking at the big figures throughout history and learning from them. But I think there's something to say, like, I'm going to look at the men of the past and I'm going to learn from them and I'm going to even respect them and uphold them. Obviously, we're not going to fall into worshiping the saints. Well, they wouldn't say they worship the saints, praying to the saints like the Roman Catholic Church does. and some other traditions within creedal Christianity. However, maybe there could be more room for us in other areas of society to uplift and extol the men of the past and say,
Yeah.
look what this guy did. That's something to learn from.
Yeah. I just think of that, and maybe I was going to say, have sports become what replaced honoring the great cloud of witnesses from before us? And so Lutherans in America might be uncomfortable with celebrating the festival of a saint or something like that. I think the feast day of St. Bartholomew is coming up soon. For the first time, I think in our church's history, we not synod, but my individual congregation's history, we celebrated the feast of St. Peter and Paul. And it was really an awesome opportunity to talk about how God worked through these people. And we obviously always celebrate Reformation and what God did through Martin Luther. And so there's that opportunity to think about the great things people have done. And so would we say that's not manly to celebrate the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul? That's not manly to celebrate the feast day of St. Bartholomew. Well, he was filleted for the faith. He was pretty manly. I think it's great to celebrate him. Or what Martin Luther did, standing up to not only the church of his day, but the government of his day as well. But maybe taking that then back to sports.
Could I tie that quickly? So this past Sunday, I did something similar in that I did a theme and parts sermon. I had 2 parts to it, and in the illustration in both of them, I referenced martyrs of the Christian faith. So the first one I mentioned, St. Stephen, the first martyr, Jan Hus, early Reformation martyr, and then Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who in some senses could be called a martyr as well. And then in the other illustration, I talked about St. Lawrence, who had supposedly been roasted over a fire and quipped in the face of death, turn me over because I'm done on this side.
Yeah.
I think there's something great that men can do to celebrate those individuals and say, look what the Lord had done for them.
Yeah.
Much like Paul had that prayer of thanksgiving for the Thessalonian Christians who stood up in the face of persecution. We can thank God for the good things those men have done. Then expanding it. Can we give thanks to God for the feats that other men have done in the athletic world? More than just the Christian ones, more than just like, hey, that was really cool when that guy talked about his faith after the game.
Yeah.
Tim Tebow, John 3:16, eye black. I think more people Googled John 3:16 than people had ever done before.
Yeah.
Obviously, Google wasn't that old at the point, but it was a wonderful witness.
Yeah. And so I think talking about it in the sports realm, I think maybe some who critique it, perhaps it comes from a little bit of like a projecting masculinity and maybe even an insecurity. It doesn't make me less of a man to recognize the work of some other man like that. I can be secure enough in myself. We as Christians quite literally lift high the cross of a man, the God man, our Lord Jesus Christ, and we're all about this man Jesus. I'm secure enough in myself that I can thank God for the work of other men and great Christian women as well. And then as I think about the sports fandom, in some ways I understand where the critique comes from. I think I can reference this because it's become pretty mainstream. Something like Barstool Sports, now it's on Fox Sports 1, where they get into their gambling cave and they kind of have this personality that they play up to because it's supposed to be entertainment, and they're yelling at each other over the games that they're gambling about. And someone recently, a friend of mine recently brought this quote to me, this thought to me, and he said, we take serious things unseriously and unserious things seriously. And I thought, that's really true. And so there is maybe an element of, we take sports so seriously. People are sweating out their bets and they're gambling on us, and it's just such an obsession. You see people arguing with each other about what this team did against this team, and it's like, you're not actually playing. And so I do understand the critique, but again, at the same time, it's just supposed to be fun.
Yeah, but I wonder if I would push back a little bit of the thought of saying that it's totally unserious. So one time I remember, maybe I'm misquoting, but there was an NFL quarterback who was asked, uh, based off of what the other quarterback said, if he thinks that God is rooting for
It was
one
Aaron
team,
Rodgers. Yeah.
one team or the other. So they were playing the Seahawks, and I think Russell Wilson was the other quarterback. And then he had said something like, "I don't think that God cares
Yeah.
about what happens in this game." I would push back to that.
Yeah.
I think God cares about what happens in sports. Actually, I know what God cares because God cares about people. And then even looking out at a secular approach to these things, sports have had a lot of impact in our world. We can talk about how sports have dipped into politics and people are a little frustrated about that. But why has sports
Yeah.
dipped into politics?
Because sports matters.
Because they recognize this matters and we have a platform that can impact
Yeah.
things. There's a reason that sports bring in a ton of money to universities and actually then aid research.
Yeah.
There's a reason why people want to use their platform, because sports matter.
And so here's a case to say that actually being a sports fan is manly, and not just in the sense that men are supposed to like football, but a true man of God is going to be outward focused as he looks to serve God by serving neighbor. And I'm going to be able to serve neighbor by knowing how my community ticks and what's important to people. And when I know that this team is important, I'm going to be able to connect with that person and be able to relate with them and grow a relationship with them in a way that's different than just acting like it doesn't matter, or even mocking the idea of, oh, how dare you wear a jersey of some other guy. Well, if I am caring about this community and this is important to people, then I can care about it. And that's actually being manly as I'm looking to serve and love my neighbor, as we've been called to as godly men.
Yeah. And on the other side, it's okay to not be interested in certain things,
Yeah.
right? So if your thought is, I'm going to have certain tabs on and an idea of what's going on in the realm of sports that matters to the people in my life, but I'm not going to watch the games myself because I would rather do chores around the house. I would rather read a book, do something I feel is more constructive. That's a great approach as well.
And maybe doesn't completely connect to sports, but I think it's a valuable time to just talk about like authenticity and being who you are. If you don't like sports, like that's okay. I think the average sports fan isn't going to be all that upset if you just say, hey, I don't like sports. And don't be the person that's sitting at the Super Bowl party that says, like, go sports ball or whatever. And don't be obnoxious about it. Again, because we acknowledge that like this does matter to people, even if you don't think it's that important. It does matter to people. But be who you are. And so I like sports. I like to watch football. I like to keep tabs on the Green Bay Packers. And I know it used to be the thing that they would say, oh, don't bring your fandom into your location. But I think especially Gen Z and younger millennials care about authenticity and just being yourself. And if I like sports, that's okay. I'm going to just be myself and like sports. I find it fun for a bunch of different reasons. I talked about community. We've talked in the past when we did the lesson or the episode on watching TV, and it's good and godly to have rest and entertainment, and sports give me that. I just think of all the different blessings we've talked about. And so if people like sports, it's a good thing, and just be who you are. If you like sports, be who you are and enjoy sports.
Yeah, have a balance in it. Make sure you're not too much of just a person who sits and watches.
Yeah.
If you enjoy watching, maybe you would also enjoy playing, and that could be a great time spent with your children, playing with them. Or if you don't have children yet, with others in your community. Maybe start up a rec league team with some neighbors or even members of your church, and just say, hey, this is how we're going to get out and we're going to interact with people and we're going to experience some of these blessings, and say, are there other things that I could do that are blessings as well? But recognizing sports can be a wonderful blessing. So I think we got enough into that response to the idea of it's not manly to watch sports and just be a spectator and root for other men. Did you have another one we wanted to look at?
Yeah, another thought to react to is this idea that sports are kind of a pastor's worst nightmare. And maybe explaining that a little bit. Youth sports culture and how much time it takes. It used to be, there was a day and age when Wednesdays and Sundays were kind of untouchable. People understood, hey, there's catechism instruction and Bible study on Wednesday nights. There's church on Sunday, so the leagues didn't do games at those times. But now youth sports have taken over. But then also people skip in church to watch a game. So there's this idea out there that maybe sports are kind of a pastor's worst nightmare. What do you think about that?
Yeah, sometimes I understand it. Sometimes I get frustrated by the pastoral response to it. And not pastoral as in this is the pastoral heart, but how pastors sometimes respond to it. And so I get it because we're not that far removed from having these hollowed out times that were reserved for the church. Mm-hmm. We played for a public school, middle school football team, and they recognized that the Catholic Church and a lot of the Lutheran churches had their catechism on Wednesdays. So we didn't have practice at that time.
Yeah.
And then there weren't games on Sundays because they recognized that society, that those people, a lot of them would have church. So that wasn't that long ago, right? That was when we were 13 years old. That's 17 years ago, and how much it's changed and how quickly it's changed. So I understand the pastor's frustration. I also served as the youth pastor at a congregation, and I felt the frustration as well that people would miss so many worship services because they had another tournament for volleyball, for soccer, for softball, for basketball. They would have these tournaments, and it would just take them away from church. And I would always just wonder with the parents, what priorities are you teaching your children? That my enjoyment, my sports, they're more important than regularly gathering with the people of God. Now, the reason I would say I want to temper this and talk about how I don't love the pastor's response to it all the time is because sometimes it's more because the pastor's frustrated that his numbers aren't up. Well, this family's gone, and that means I have 6 less people to report that I had at worship on Sunday, rather than asking the holistic question about how is this family staying connected to the body of believers in the means of grace? Because there are some families, and I could think about them, I'm not going to name them, who did it in an excellent way.
Yeah.
They said, you know what? My son has a tournament this weekend. We can't make it on Sunday, but we have a sister church on that has worship on Saturday. We're going to be there, and we're going to give pastor a text message that say, hey, pastor, we're sorry we're not going to be there. And even when one of the siblings might need to be there for another reason, to coordinate with other people to get them there. So there were families who navigated through this very well, and that taught their kids too.
Yeah.
Maybe it didn't teach the same lesson as you can't go to the tournament because there's church, but it still taught a pretty powerful lesson, I think.
And so maybe a healthy understanding of what we believe the third commandment to mean would play into this conversation. So remember the Sabbath day. We are not Sabbatarians. We understand that the Sabbath was given as a shadow of the things to come. I may be pulling up Colossians right now to read that passage for us. This is a shadow of the things to come. So it foreshadowed the rest that we would have in Christ, that we now have in Christ. And so how do we receive that Sabbath rest today? We go to the places where Jesus promises to be there for us, for rest, for the forgiveness of sins. We go to church. We read the word. There, Jesus is for us, for our forgiveness, for our rest. And so we are not bound by a specific day in the same way. Now, it is good to have a specific day, but we want to be careful the way we talk about this because we're not going to church on Saturdays. That's just not what we're doing. So we want to be able to properly address this and say we are honoring the spirit of the Sabbath, by gathering where Jesus has promised to be with us for our forgiveness, for our rest, to receive that rest. And we do it on a Sunday because it's a mini Easter celebration. But I think sometimes there's this improper understanding of what the Sabbath is. Is that what you were doing?
Yeah,
pulling up
well, I was
Colossians?
looking, no, I was going to Hebrews 10.
Oh, okay.
So Hebrews 10 says, "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching." So I'm not trying to give an excuse to not go to worship on Sunday if that's when your church gathers. And that's when most churches do gather. But the ultimate goal is to be connected to God's people and his means of grace. And if someone misses that Sunday gathering every once in a while for a reason that includes sports, it's not necessarily an indicator of a big weakness of faith that they might have. All right. But we do need to talk about what is the truth for so many people.
Yeah.
And the truth is that communicating priorities to your family is a really important thing. And children are creatures of habit, and being there Sunday after Sunday after Sunday is such an important thing to communicate to them, and then also communicate to everyone else around you and be a witness to them. So skipping that game could be a testimony to your team about what's truly most important.
Yeah. And so if you never miss the Sunday game, you're always there because the sport is number one in life. Like you said, that's not only a negative message to the people you're playing with, though. You Christians really aren't that different, are you? It's also a negative testimony to your fellow members of the congregation, and it's teaching your children what is important in life, and that church is not the most important. And then in connection, the gospel is not the most important. Like, that's a terrible message to send. And so I love sports. I love watching. I love playing. Like, we talked about all these benefits, but if you teach your children that the sport is more important than going to church, that is a terrifying message to send.
Yeah. And we don't need to get too much into the pastor's perspective on this, but I just want to point out that sports in some ways can be the pastor's best friend. An easy way to break the ice and connect with people is to talk about the local team. Easy way to connect with your families of your congregation is to go to their kids' game.
Yeah.
So it can be such an easy connecting point with other people to use sports. So to recognize that it's not all bad when it comes to sports in the ministry.
Yeah. There's another point that I wanted to throw out there. I think actually you had sent me this video. It was a guy that was making a case that adults have ruined sports for kids. And basically, if you remember what he was saying, he was saying as adults, we mock the idea of participation trophies. Maybe I'm more comfortable with that because we got participation trophies in flag football. But they mock the idea of the participation trophy, but then when you sign up for a 5K, what does everyone get? They get a participation trophy. We give them to adults. Or the idea that as adults, you can just kind of play a leisure sport for fun and no one can get mad at you for not practicing and not putting in the work and not having it be your number one priority. You can go golf, you can go disc golf, you can go and join a bar league softball team. And again, no one's going to get mad at you and you don't even need to be good. And so then for youth sports, we're like, this needs to be your number one priority. You need to put in all of this work and you need to be good. Otherwise you're going to get cut.
Yeah, I think there is a huge downside. So we talked about the benefits that sports bring, and then we aired caution about some of the downsides that sports have, and maybe that is actually the result of how the youth sports culture has become. So I have 4 kids, and they are entering the age that I would like them to get a little bit more involved in organized sports activities. So we had the girls doing gymnastics before we moved, and now looking at different activities. And it's really challenging to find something that is at the level that I want it to be,
Mm-hmm.
because everyone wants it at a level that's much higher than they're actually at. I would like my 8-year-old just to have the opportunity to play soccer and see if she likes it.
Yeah.
I don't need to prepare her for the next level. And this attitude towards glorifying youth sports, or using this as a means to greater success or money in the future, I think has made it a problem for many children. The truth of the matter is, a lot of kids can't play in high school at bigger high schools because they're not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And they miss out on a lot of those benefits, or they just miss out on having fun.
Yeah. So I think it was Charles Barkley said that he doesn't believe there should be tryouts for sports before high school. And I actually, I agree with that. And I understand the practicality of you're at a big middle school and it's to play for the school's team, and you just have to have tryouts for who's going to make the team because there's so many kids who want to play. But the eighth graders are at such different positions as they're growing up, and to just cut the person because they haven't hit a certain level of maturity yet, I mean, just from a practical perspective, and this is what Charles Barkley is saying, is not wise, because that person might be technically more skilled, but then they're going to go on and grow later on in life. And you hear of guys like Giannis Antetokounmpo, who, I mean, grew a significant amount from the time he was drafted in the NBA until his first couple of years. But then also just from a perspective of almost none of these kids are going pro. Almost none of them. Why do we need to treat it like this is the road to go pro? Why do we need to treat it like this is the road to get a D1 scholarship? You're most likely not getting a D1 scholarship. And can't this just be an opportunity for, like we said, the team building, the discipline, and enjoyment? That's really what we think sports are valuable for. But then we take it so seriously. And sometimes it seems like it's these parents who are trying to live out their failed dreams and have made it unhealthy for their children, that it's, like you said, it's all about going to the next level. It's like, why can't it just be enjoyment right now?
Yeah, I think that's something that's really important to consider. And I think there could be lessons still for the players who are better than the others. So the idea is we want the team to be good enough to succeed. And some people think, well, if you don't cut some players, that'll be frustrating for the more talented players. That's how life is. You're going to have to work on a team with people who aren't as technically skilled.
Yeah.
So that's a lesson that you can learn. How are we going to get through this situation? How can I uplift that other person, rather than just say this person shouldn't be on the team or they shouldn't be on the court?
Yeah. And so I think there's a lot of things that we could talk about, just the lack of an ability for kids to enjoy sports. And maybe that's something we're not going to be able to change, but maybe it's something that as a culture we could talk about a little bit more of how can we allow sports to be fun? Because I know of people who did not like playing football in high school, who eventually quit because it just stopped being fun, because they felt like people cared too much. And it's like, where is that opportunity to just play for the fun of the sport?
And get exercise.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who don't love weightlifting, they don't love running, but a game can be a great way for exercise. So to allow teens to have that, and then to continue doing that for the rest of their lives, it could be a great opportunity in there for them.
And maybe this last thought that I wanted to maybe just talk about a little bit isn't really a reaction to something that's said, but more just something we could talk about a little bit. The idea of sports helping to encourage the stewardship of the body. We have been given these bodies to take care of, and maybe there's some things to consider on both ends of how sports can end up being poor stewardship of the body, but also how it promotes taking care of the body that we've been given.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you look at your body and say this is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And the thought in scripture that's given in connection to that is therefore don't unite your body with a prostitute, right? Flee from sexual immorality because of your unity with the Spirit. But it also should make us think about caring for our bodies in other senses as well. And sports can be a great avenue for teaching and learning about these things. Kids who play sports think about nutrition a lot. They think about weightlifting. They think about stretching. And those things can be taught and learned about how do I care for this body that God has given to me. And this body matters.
Mm-hmm.
Why does this body matter? Because Christ took on a human body. So he therefore uplifted what this human reality is in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And also because Christ ascended bodily, glorified, and because we know that we too will be resurrected, we will be glorified. These bodies are our eternal bodies that we will have in heaven. So they matter.
So let's take care of these bodies. And I think learning to play a sport might give you a skill to be able to play for the rest of your life to help take care of your body. So you like to play basketball, great. You can go to any gym and go play basketball for the rest of your life and take care of your body in that way. You learn to run, you can do that the rest of your life. You learn to ride a bike, which is sport in a different way, I suppose, but it's still the skill that you can take care of your body with. And sports taught people to do these things for their lives to take care of their bodies. I still like to weightlift because it's good for my body. I learned to do that because I played football. And so there is value to that. I guess one thing that I was interested in talking about was how about this idea that maybe some sports are bad for your health? And so the big conversation is CTE, because they would say it's not the big hits, it's the small hits over time. What can the Christians say about playing football? I know there's a lot of moms out there who are scared about their sons playing football.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say about that actually playing football is bad for your health?
Yeah, that's something that I think is important to consider, especially as it's getting more sight. Romeo Doubs on the Green Bay Packers wearing a Guardian cap and catching 3 touchdowns doing it. That brought a lot of attention to the Guardian cap. And there was also that movie about CTE that came out not that long ago. And this has been on the public narrative. And then I even think back to my not stellar or all that long football career of 7th grade through sophomore year of college, and I did sustain concussions. Maybe this isn't the pastoral thus saith the Lord perspective here, but more of just my contemplations as I, as a Christian, am wrestling through a challenging thing. But God also doesn't call us to a life of complete comfort all the time. God calls us to carry the cross, and sometimes that means going through difficult things and putting ourselves in the situation where we could get hurt. So I don't want to say, well, the proper Christian response is to just do things that won't ever hurt you. Because sometimes God has called us to go do something that's going to hurt us physically, but it will be a blessing to our neighbor.
So I know this is a big conversation around COVID. It's always a conversation. You can't get rid of all risk. It's not possible. There's inherent risk by stepping into a building, because I need to have trust or faith that the people who built this building knew what they were doing, and maybe there's a chance that they didn't. Or there's inherent risk by getting out onto the road and driving, because I need to trust that they're going to follow the rules of the road and stay on their side. And so we're talking about mitigating risk in a way that is for the good of others and good of ourselves. So to what level of risk is okay? And that's where it's kind of hard to exactly think through all of these things. But even like you said, at times, putting someone in a position where there's no risk is actually more harmful for them. So there's this idea, I think it comes from a book we talked about last time, The Anxious Generation, how kids not breaking their arms is actually like a statistic that sounds good, but it's actually bad. That less kids are breaking their arms. Well, that doesn't mean that kids are in a better position for their overall health. It actually just means they're doing things that isn't risking them breaking their arms, and it's actually bad for them. So they're spending more time playing video games, or they're on tablets, they're not riding their bikes. Kids break their arms riding their bikes, but they're not out there doing these things that are really healthy for them, taking some risk. And so in that book, he talks about this this experiment where they wanted to see if they could build like a dome where they would have plant life on, I don't know, the moon or whatever. And so what ended up happening was they would grow these trees to a certain height and they would topple over because they needed healthy risk, I guess. They needed the wind to push them for their roots to expand. And so there's a secular perspective talking about humans needing a little bit of tension, a little bit of healthy risk for them to grow strong. And so you even think in the Christian faith, we have this idea of like tentatio, we grow through struggle. And so there is value and there's not always going to be this perfect level of safety. Now, I don't know what to say about CTE. At one point, I thought I had heard like, hey, at lower levels, it's not that hard hitting. But I guess I don't know what to say. I haven't actually looked at the research. But the reality is we're never going to be perfectly without risk this side of heaven.
So I'd say that for the Christian, the encouragement is that what you're going to want to do is you're going to study, you're going to look into these things, you're going to pray to God for discernment, and then you're going to step forward and say, I'm going to make a decision to His glory, recognizing that comfort isn't always the thing that glorifies God. So sometimes I'm going to want to take on some inherent risks as God calls me to do hard things, but I also want to make sure I'm not intentionally putting myself into danger and saying, well, the angels will catch me as I jump off of this building. So kind of a challenging thing. We can't give a direct answer for Christians, but an encouragement in how to approach it.
And so you think of that like Lutheran encouragement to sin boldly. Not that we just go and do sinful things boldly, but we live the life of the Christian, making decisions to the best of our ability, motivated by the love of Jesus to say thank you to Him, knowing that for our failures we are forgiven. And we have this whole conversation in the confidence of believers who are not saving ourselves but have been saved, and we live our lives to say thank you. That's why we do good works. That's why we're having this conversation about Christian morality, because we know that Jesus did it all for us and now we live in response to Him.
So yeah, that's how we can approach it and say, how can we as Christians use sports? Well, to the glory of God, and saying thank you to Jesus in everything we do, and having sensitivities where sensitivities are needed, having caution where caution is needed, and then going forward boldly.
God bless.